Okay, so let's dive right into this whole peace talks thing that's going on with Ukraine.
Right.
I mean, it's kind of crazy, right? We've got the U.S. and Russia supposedly talking
Yeah.
about how to end the war,
Mm-hmm.
but Ukraine isn't even at the table for these discussions.
Yes. Yes.
So we're going to take a look at what people are saying about this
Right.
and try to understand why this is even important to, you listening to this.
Absolutely.
So we've got a bunch of different news articles,
Yeah.
some official statements from people like Justin Trudeau and Zelenskyy,
Okay.
and even some comments from Donald Trump.
Interesting.
So
All right.
let's get into it. So one of the biggest things that's been in the news lately is that
Yeah.
Justin Trudeau has been pretty clear that he thinks that any peace talks absolutely have to include Ukraine.
Yeah.
He actually called it a fundamental principle.
Right.
So I kind of wanted to get your take on this.
Sure.
Like, do you think it's always possible to include every single country
Right.
in every single, negotiation?
Well, I mean, it's a really good question. And I think in a perfect world, yeah, you want everyone who's affected by something to have a seat at the table.
Right.
But the thing is, international relations are messy.
Mhm.
It's not always going to be perfectly clean
Yeah.
and easy to get everyone in the same room.
Right.
At the same time, though, I think what Trudeau is getting at here is that it's really important that Ukraine's future
Yeah.
doesn't get decided without them having any say.
Right. Exactly.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. And it's kind of interesting because Zelenskyy, the president of Ukraine,
Right.
actually postponed a trip to Saudi Arabia.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And that's where these talks between the U.S. and Russia were happening.
Interesting.
So it seems like he was maybe sending a message with that.
Yeah, it definitely.
Like he's not happy about being left out.
Right. It seems like that's a way for him to kind of show that he's not happy.
Yeah.
And to maybe put a little bit of pressure on the U.S. and Russia. He's been saying that Ukraine will not accept any peace deal that's made without them.
Right.
So it really makes you wonder what's going to happen if the U.S. and Russia just ignore that.
Yeah.
Will these talks actually achieve anything?
Right. And it's not just Zelenskyy and Ukraine that are feeling left out here.
No.
I mean, we've seen other European leaders saying that they're concerned about being excluded from these discussions too.
Yeah.
So it's like this big, important meeting
Right.
about the future of Europe.
Exactly.
But a lot of European countries aren't even invited.
Yeah, it's definitely causing some tension.
Right.
And it shows that there's this real sense of urgency among these European leaders. I mean, Trudeau's actually planning to have a virtual meeting
Oh, wow.
with other European leaders specifically to talk about Ukraine.
Okay.
So it really shows you how seriously they're taking this.
Yeah, and it makes you think will all this pressure from Europe
Right.
actually be enough to get Russia to come to the table with Ukraine?
That's the big question, isn't it?
Yeah, it's really easy to get caught up in all the politics of this.
Yeah.
But it's important to remember that there are real people
Absolutely.
whose lives are being affected by this war.
Yeah.
The UN actually reported that there have been over 40,000 civilian casualties in Ukraine
Heartbreaking.
since this all began.
It's a tragedy.
So it's like a really stark reminder that these aren't just abstract political decisions.
Right.
These are decisions that have a huge impact on real people's lives.
Yeah, the human cost of war is always the most devastating part.
Right. Right. And then
Yeah.
just to throw another wrench into things, we've got former U.S. President Trump,
Right.
who's kind of added his own perspective to all of this.
Yeah.
He's made some statements that seem to be blaming Ukraine for the war.
Oh, really?
Yeah. He's saying that he thinks that a deal could have been made
Interesting.
before the war even started to prevent it.
Okay.
And then you've got Pete Hegseth,
Right.
who is Trump's defense secretary. He's saying that going back to Ukraine's borders from before 2014 is just unrealistic.
Okay, so
I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this.
yeah, well, I mean, Trump's comments are definitely controversial,
Yeah.
but I think they do highlight something important,
Oh, yeah.
which is that this conflict has a really long and complicated history.
Right.
And if we want to find a lasting solution, we can't just ignore that history.
Yeah.
We have to address those long-standing tensions.
Yeah.
And then when you add in Hegseth's comment about the borders,
Right.
it makes you realize that negotiating a territorial settlement
Yeah.
is going to be really, really challenging.
Right. And as you might expect, Zelenskyy was not happy about Trump's comments.
Yeah, I can imagine.
He actually accused Trump of being influenced by Russian disinformation, which I guess is kind of a whole other can of worms.
Yeah, it is.
But it does bring up this really important concept of disinformation spaces.
Right.
So can you maybe explain a little bit about what that means?
Sure. So basically, disinformation spaces are these online and offline environments
Okay.
where information is being spread that's intentionally misleading
Right.
or biased.
Mm-hmm.
And the goal is often to manipulate people
Yeah.
or to create conflict. And this kind of disinformation can have a huge impact
Right.
on international relations and
Yeah.
on how countries try to resolve conflicts.
Definitely. So what about Canada's response to all of this?
Right.
Did Trudeau say anything about Trump's comments?
Well, he didn't mention Trump directly,
Okay.
but he definitely didn't hold back on criticizing Russia.
Right.
He was very clear that he blames Russia for violating international rules. And he used some really strong language to condemn their actions.
Oh, yeah.
Like what? He called them illegal, immoral, and unjust violations.
Wow.
So it's pretty clear that Canada is standing firmly with Ukraine on this.
Yeah, it definitely sounds like it.
Yeah.
So I guess the big question now is, where do we go from here? Like, what are your thoughts on the chances of actually achieving a lasting peace in Ukraine?
Honestly, it's really hard to say.
Yeah.
The situation is incredibly complex, and there are a lot of different players involved,
Right.
all with their own interests and goals.
Yeah.
The fact that these peace talks are happening is definitely a positive step,
Mm-hmm.
but I think it also shows just how divided everyone is
All right.
and how much work still needs to be done.
Yeah.
So whether international pressure will actually be enough
Right.
to bring about a peaceful resolution,
Yeah.
that remains to be seen.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It really is.
It's a tough situation with no easy answers.
Absolutely.
But I think it's important for all of us to keep learning about what's going on
Yeah,
and to think critically about the different perspectives involved.
I agree.
So as you continue to follow this story, I want you to consider this. What role do you think international pressure can play
Right.
in achieving a lasting peace in Ukraine?
It's a question worth thinking about.
It is.
Yeah. Sure.
Thanks for joining me for this deep dive.
Of course.
It's been a really thought-provoking discussion.
It has.
And hopefully we've given you some things to think about
Yeah.
as this situation continues to unfold.